the recording. Let's go ahead and start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Mankowski. Welcome to the webinar on the Cascades to Coast Landscape Collaborative and this presentation on the newly released Coastal Northwest Landscape Conservation Mapper. I'm John Mankowski. I'm the facilitator for the Cascade to Coast leadership team, and I welcome you to our webinar today. We're here today because many of us are in the conservation world or working lands world, and we're looking for ways to work towards commonly held values in larger geographies at larger scales, whether it's biodiversity, climate adaptation, sustaining work in farms and forests, or creating vibrant and rural urban communities. That's sort of what brings us to a conversation like this today. And I'm really happy to see such a nice turnout for an audience for the webinar like this. We're also looking to connect our work at larger scales to reach outcomes beyond which we can do alone. So that's part of the conversation we want to have today as well. And lastly, we are looking to collaborate in new ways with diverse partners. And the CCLC is about both that and allows that to occur through our Coastal Northwest Conservation Mapper. We have a very diverse audience here today. I'm quite pleased to announce we have over 270 people registered on this topic of interest. People are joining from Washington and Oregon, as you would imagine, but also as far away as Canada, Alaska, Hawaii, some of the Midwest states, and even some on the East Coast are interested in hearing this presentation, thinking about these tools and how they can apply them to their work to advance their conservation at larger scales. We have a variety of organizations joining us today. We welcome tribal nations, our federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, a whole host of NGOs and land trusts. We also have people registered from academia, both professors, researchers, and students, as well as landowners and private sector business. The kinds of people joining today are policymakers, organizational leaders, practitioners, biologists, foresters, range ecologists, geographers, cultural resource specialists, planners, researchers, teachers, and students. So it's really a pleasure to see such a diverse group of people in the Pacific Northwest and beyond come together about landscape scale planning and landscape scale conservation work. A couple of quick words about our Zoom webinar features before we get going. And first, I would like to point out there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please enter questions as they come to mind here during the presentation. We're going to collect them and pose them to our speakers towards the end of the session. So if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A box if it's for one of our panelists. We'd also encourage you to use the chat function. Please use this feature to share your thoughts or ideas, requests for follow-up, etc. This chat will be saved as part of the meeting summary. It'll be an important part of our follow-up to this event. Also, at the end of this session, you'll receive a post-event survey. It's very brief, but please fill that out. We'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can improve these types of webinars, and importantly, how we can improve the tool that you're going to learn about today. So we invite you to take a minute or two to complete this survey. Ellen Yanahan from the Fish and Wildlife Service is monitoring the chat, and we'll be posting information and reminders there periodically as well. And yes, this webinar will be recorded. You will receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email when it's available, probably in 2 days. So finally, landscape conservation is all about community. So please help us build and expand our community here and now by introducing yourself in the chat box. Just take a minute, type in your name, your organization, and where you're connecting from. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Tom Mewald, holding the fish in the screen in front of you. He currently works for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS in Oregon, where he coordinates the state's Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Many of you may have heard about this, the RCPP program. Before that, he worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a conservation planner and geographer. He helped found the CCLC, this partnership, and is active on the leadership team. He also worked previously for the Wild Salmon Center as a conservation planner and data scientist. So it's really a privilege to have him join us today to share his intellect and some of the thinking behind this mapper tool, what it's designed to do, and how it helps advance conservation in the region. Tom's going to kick off the session by introducing you to the partnership and provide some high-level perspective on the importance and the genesis of this tool. Following Tom, we'll hear from Erin Butts. She's the GIS specialist and the project manager at SWCA Environmental Consultants. She specializes in data wrangling, GIS applications such as ArcGIS Online, and tool development. She's been involved in building this conservation mapper since the beginning, and will be providing an overview of the tool along with a demonstration of its capabilities and a couple of use cases. Both Tom and Erin will be available to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So once again, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to log your questions, and they will be shared with the presenters at the end of the session. And feel free to type thoughts or comments or ideas in the chat box as well. Tom?
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks so much, John. And as John said, I started working with the CCLC several years ago. And I was working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with their refuge system. And one of the questions that we had is, how do we invest in land protection at a landscape scale? And how do we do this in a way that is collaborative? How do we do it in a way that is data-driven? So we got engaged with the CCLC with that in mind. And really, what we found is that there are a lot of different agencies and organizations that have that same exact question. So that's really the problem that the CCLC is trying to solve. And with the RCPP and NRCS, we have the same question. How do we invest in the landscape in a way that is collaborative, based on science, and really focuses on those places that you get the highest return on investment for your conservation dollars? And I think that's what really CCLC is meant to do. We do have an ambitious mission of trying to achieve a connected network of functioning resilient ecosystems, as you see. And we do this through looking at a collaborative approach using science-based strategies. So to meet that mission, we've identified 3 goals. And the first one is what you'll be hearing about today from Erin. And that's, we're creating a spatial tool to help support management plans, to help address those questions like we had with the refuge system. Where do we invest for our conservation priorities? We don't want to just develop maps, we also want to develop strategies. And we want to manage landscapes along with partners. That's kind of what CCLC is trying to catalyze. And we want to do that in a partnership setting. And that's really what that 3rd goal is about. Next slide, John. So the map you see on the left, that really tells a big story about the ecoregion that we're talking about. It is, there's a diverse ownership. You can see that there's this matrix of private land interspersed with these blocks of public land. So how do we get people to think outside of their boundaries? How do we get them to think outside of their particular management plans for their particular block of land, and think about the lands adjacent to them, the lands that they could be connecting in the future? So to help kind of move that along, this is where this collaborative forum concept idea came about with CCLC. So we want to understand landscape scale stressors and develop strategies to address those. Next slide. And so the slide that you'll be seeing now is kind of what we think of as our theory of change. So you can see that we have regional challenges that we've identified through a suite of workshops, looking at invasive species, climate change, increased development from population into the region, and then silent decision making. So we've identified these with a time frame of 30 to 50 years. We're trying to get people to think, what does the next 30 to 50 years look like in this landscape, and how can we plan for that? We know that it's going to look very different given these regional challenges, and how do they impact our values that we've identified? And really what we're trying to do, and kind of the role of CCLC, is to kind of provide this dual mandate. of one, bringing people together through a collaborative forum, and the second is mapping collective values. That's what you're going to hear about today, is that section of it, is how we are addressing that important part of the science and co-producing that with a broad range of stakeholders. Ultimately, what this should bring is, if we're consistent and we keep doing this, it'll meet our mission of resilient and connected landscapes. Next slide. What we're trying to do is develop a collaborative conservation design through mapping collective values. And basically what that means is we want to identify those areas on the landscape that will bring the highest return on investment for our conservation dollars. And there's really four legs of the table of spatial design that we're bringing together. The first is landscape science, and you'll probably be hearing about this in future webinars of the habitat connectivity work that we're looking at, modeling habitat connectivity across the region for a broad range of species. What you're going to be hearing about today is that second box, the synthesis of different values and conservation values and human well-being values and economic values that people have identified through a broad outreach strategy. And then, it's really great science and web-based tools are useful and they're neat to look at, but they really, they're destined to sit there in the internet if there isn't a collaborative forum and a way to provide conservation delivery based upon that information and science. So those are really kind of the other two parts of this equation, collaborative forum, and then the other tool that you'll be hearing about at some point is the incentive program explorer. And it's really meant to align conservation actions and leverage for larger scale impact. And so that's a tool that will be developed alongside this. So what you're going to be hearing about today from Aaron is the result of a lot of data wrangling and working collaboratively with partners to identify key data features. And so hopefully together, these tools and approaches lead to conservation investments within a landscape approach. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Erin and she will tell you the details of this tool. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom. So as you just heard, the CCLC wanted to create a spatial tool that could act as a decision support tool and a resource for identifying priority places across the region and to increase collaboration in order to create a sustainable landscape into the future. And we wanted that to be respectful towards a diversity of values found across our landscape, including wildlife, working lands, climate resiliency, and ecosystem services. So we wanted to create this decision support tool to guide discussions and identify potential conservation strategies and collaboration opportunities. The mapper that I'll show you can also be used to identify areas that could benefit from further fine-scale investigation or lend supporting information in the search for funding opportunities. We knew we wanted this tool to be interactive and provide useful information to a variety of stakeholders. So in creating this interactive mapper, we wanted to create a landscape design that integrated multiple values at the ecoregional scale. Some of the things we considered in the process of gathering data and creating the spatial syntheses included considering what the current status of conservation efforts or the condition of the landscape, and identifying where different data gaps are found across the region. We used readily available data sets to represent our targets for conservation, working forests, and ecosystem services, including recreation, cultural values, and services for human health. These targets were used to guide our spatial design in order to represent a sustainable landscape into the future that could be used by our variety of partners in order to leverage collaborative efforts. As I go through and introduce the Coastal Northwest Landscape Conservation Mapper, I will go through these 4 key questions. First, who is involved and who the mapper is meant for, then what conditions and values we're looking to conserve, where these areas are found across our landscape, and how to implement conservation strategies in the future. So first, who is a part of our network to implement a landscape conservation plan? Everyone on this call is a part of our network. As you saw in one of Tom's slides, and you'll see here, there's a wide variety of different landowners across our region, and they all have different zoning types, urban growth boundaries, land management, and protection statuses. This is a large part of why mapping shared values has been so important for the CCLC, so that we can map the collective values that we have and have a shared starting point for discussions and future planning. This next slide shows a web of connections that was created based on a social network analysis done by Ken Vance Borland for the CCLC. There are over 2,000 named collaborators, and the different colors represent the different types of organizations, and the lines and arrows show who they are all connected to. The CCLC wants to help encourage continued collaboration with the use of this landscape conservation mapper. So what is the condition of the values that we want to conserve? As we are going through this, it's really difficult to make one map of landscape values when we have so many different collaborators and different values across the landscape. So we decided to do 3 different data syntheses to represent the variety of values and allow users to see each of them and how they overlap and complement each other. So we focused on working forests, ecosystem services, and biological conservation. And the connectivity piece fits into our biological conservation values. So these values are not isolated from one another, and they all need to be considered in order to create a sustainable landscape into the future. These values and the data that we ended up using were not decided on solely by myself or the leadership team. This slide shows there were many people involved in a number of meetings in order to identify data sets and values for each of the syntheses we did. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone who helped in this process, and it was a lot of work. So where are these important areas on the landscape? And that's why we created our Coastal Northwest Landscape Conservation Mapper, so that we could show where these values are. You can access the mapper through the CCLC website, and there's a button to launch the mapper and to access the user guide. I'll show this again later as well. So the following slides are going to be screenshots from the mapper showing some of the data and the synthesis products that are available within it. So I have some input data sets shown on the left here and one of the syntheses on the right. And I'll just go through this for our different targets. And all of this is found within the interactive mapper. So first here I have some ecosystem services. Not all the inputs are shown, but we have inputs such as drinking water and carbon storage potential. And then you can see on the right, there's a legend here, the darker green areas being where multiple important ecosystem services are found. We have working lands data, and this synthesis was done slightly differently in order not to prioritize certain lands over the others, because all working lands in our area are important. And we included information such as soil site class, contiguous timberland, and distance to processing mills. Our third synthesis was conservation priorities. There are too many inputs to show on a slide, but it included information such as threatened and endangered species, wetlands, oak habitat, as well as other representative species and ecosystem types. We did the synthesis splitting between public and private lands. A lot of our conservation priorities and values can be achieved on public lands. However, private lands also need to be considered to meet all of our conservation targets and to tell the whole conservation story on such a varied landscape. We also have additional data within the tool. We have information such as threats. This example is showing future development threats, so future development and future population growth, and information on resiliency such as climate change resilience, and as well as additional data sets within the mapper. Currently, we have a limited amount of connectivity data. Right now, we have a naturalness landscape connectivity for the Washington side of our study area. That is available within the mapper currently. The CCLC has also finishing up a species connectivity project with the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group. That connectivity data will soon be located within the mapper as well. That is being done for these 5 species here. And Oregon is undergoing a statewide effort for connectivity, and these 3 species are being done for our study area and will also be available in the future. Connectivity is really important for conservation and connecting lands, and we will have the CCLC will have a special session on that in the future. So within the mapper, we've begun thinking about what users can do with this data and how they can use this data to come up with different conservation strategies. So strategies within the mapper are overlays of data that aim to answer questions such as where are there threats to working lands? How do we keep working lands working into the future? Where are areas that could benefit from restoration efforts? Or where are lands that could provide climate refugia into the future? One of the examples is shown here in this screenshot. This is for conservation, our conservation agreement strategy. So this is areas where high value connectivity areas overlap with forest landowners and there's some level of development threat. Seeing this can allow users to communicate the importance of working lands and their role in maintaining connectivity for wildlife. A number of potential strategies could come from this, keeping working lands working, coming up with different conservation agreements, or it could lead to different incentive programs for forest landowners. We made a few different strategies in the mapper to illustrate areas where different strategies may be useful based on overlays from data that's all found within the mapper. They aren't necessarily firm boundaries nor the only strategies that may be useful. We know also that individual organizations and groups will have their own strategies already set and might not need these. But we wanted these strategies to encourage further discussion and to give examples on how data in the mapper can be overlaid to gain additional insights into the landscape. So we have strategies such as the conservation agreements that I showed. We have a restoration strategy highlighting areas that have a degraded landscape condition and important conservation areas. We have a climate focused strategy, which has high conservation priority areas that also have high levels of terrestrial climate change resilience. And we have a transportation strategy, which is areas where important connectivity overlaps with highways. So now that we have some background on the landscape conservation mapper and have seen some of the data it contains, I'm going to go through a quick tour of the site. There are a lot of tools and a lot of information found within it. So I encourage everyone to take a look on their own and to go along with the user guide to get more information. So I'll go through this quick tour and then I'll do another demo showing some of the functionality before I go into a couple of use cases. And I just want to remind everyone as we go through that the goal for this tool is to serve as a decision support tool and to spark further discussion and collaboration at the regional scale. So when the tool first opens, you'll be greeted by this splash screen that has some basic information, including a link to the CCLC website and a link to a more thorough user guide, which will have information on how to navigate the mapper, information on the data included, as well as some step-by-step examples on some of the tools found within. Once we click out of the splash screen, you'll see an intro map that highlights some of our analyses. It does not show everything. It's a subset of the data, and you can see what it's displaying in the legend there. If you click on the map, you'll get pop-ups with additional information. The pop-ups will change based on what layers you have turned on. And from this zoomed out perspective, when you click, it will select many different planning units. So you can click through the arrows to see different information in the pop-ups. To navigate the map, you can scroll in and out on your mouse to zoom in and out. A single click will activate the pop-up, a double click will zoom you in further, and then clicking and dragging will pan across the map. You can also zoom with the buttons, the plus and minus on the left, or return to the initial extent with the home button. There's also a search bar if you're looking for a specific location on the landscape. And underneath are a few tools. The first one is the Add Data tool, so users can add additional data. You can add this from ArcGIS Online. If your organization has an AGOL account, or if you have your own AGOL account, you can add from there. If you have web service URLs, those can be added as well. And files from your computer can also be added. This next icon brings back up the legend, which will update based on what layers are showing in the map. And the icon next to this is an interactive selection tool where users can select visible layers by drawing on the map. The default is going to be a rectangle. So you can make a selection. And then if you click on the ellipses next to the layer, there are a variety of options on things you can do with this layer. I'm going to clear the selection and go to bookmarks. So there's a couple of bookmarks already available. Users can create their own in order to return to an area of interest the next time they open the tool. And bookmarks will be saved for your instance. So if you return to the tool, your bookmarks will still be there. There's also a print option. It's somewhat limited in its functionality, but you can export a map from the tool. There are some advanced settings so that you can play with it to get it to look how you'd like and to change the title, change the quality of the export, and you can export it into a variety of formats. We see this as being really useful in collaborating and communicating with others about the data. And this top blue ribbon at the top is going to be where most of our tools are located. If you click on the logo on the very left-hand side, it will open the CCLC website in another tab. We also have a link to our Landowner Conservation Program Explorer, which will be launched later this fall, and then our main section of tools. First, we have an info tab. That's going to have citation information as well as a link to the user guide. We have a support tab, which has the CCLC website again, as well as contact information if you have any troubles or questions. And then we get into some of our layer lists. This first one is going to have our intro display, as well as all of the synthesis information. So you can see we've got ecosystem services, working lands, and conservation showing here. That first layer that's shown, spatial analysis, interpreted results, it has all of the attribute information for every data set found within the tool. And if you turn it on, it will just show outlines of our planning units and study area. And it's mostly used to inform the other tools. And when you click the three dots next to a layer, you'll have lots of options to zoom, change transparency, change the pop-ups, move it around, view the attribute table, or if you click show item details, there's metadata for every layer included in this mapper. The next layer list is our connectivity data. Right now, it's just the landscape connectivity for Washington, but it will have the Oregon and Washington data in the future. And the next layer lists we have are organized into our different synthesis categories. We've got ecosystem services, conservation, and working lands. These are all of the data sets that went into those analyses. If you click on the little arrow next to it, you can see most of the data sets, when appropriate, are categorized into relative values of high, moderate, and low. For those who wish to see how those were categorized or to see the raw values, that's included in the metadata and the attribute tables so that it's transparent. And then our last layer list has information on threats and resiliency data. You can see there's a lot more than what I showed in those screenshots. We also have some infographics so you can visually see the percentage and number of planning units that fall into each category for our different synthesis information. When you hover over it, it will highlight some of those planning units on the left-hand side as well. And for this, it will also change based on your interactive selection that's underneath that search bar on the left. We have infographics also for development threats and for climate resiliency. And again, these will also change based on the interactive selection tool found over here on the left. And when you hover over, you'll get the full title of the category, but you can click the arrows as well to scroll through the legend for the infographics. This next tab is the strategies that I mentioned earlier. And again, they're based on queries or overlays of the data found within the mapper. And they're meant to be a guide and lead to further fine-scale investigation or larger regional discussions. We also have the ability for users to select planning units based on location. So if you have a specific area of interest, either drawn onto the map with these tools here, or based on features from another layer, either within the mapper or one that you've added yourself. There's a little more tab since they didn't all fit across here, and there's a select by location infographic that will be based on that tool I just showed. There's nothing in there since I haven't run it yet, but I will show that in the next demo. And lastly, we have a tab for base maps in case users would like to see different reference data, such as imagery. So that was a fairly quick tour of the tool. There are many little details I did not cover. So it would be really great to go through with the user guide and see any things I didn't show. But I will go through a short demo on how a user might go about using the tool, and then I'll cover a couple of specific use cases. So for this demo, I'm gonna use the Upper Chehalis Water Resource Inventory area as my area of interest. First, I'll add it to the data. I'll add the data set to the map, and I know it's on ArcGIS Online, so I will search for it and add it. If you're looking on ArcGIS Online for new data, you can click the Details button in order to see more information before adding it to the map. So since I'm interested in a specific watershed, I'm going to select that, and I don't need to select any of the result information. So I will uncheck that and zoom into this area here. So already from the intro layers, we can see that some of the information that's found in my area of interest. So again, the intro layers are a subset of the information found, so I will want to look through the layer lists also. Since I'm going to be looking at this area of interest frequently, I'm going to make a bookmark for it. When you make a bookmark, it will also keep the layer visibility that you have set at the time of creation. So in this case, it's going to keep that intro display and the water resource inventory area layers showing. So next, I will look through some of the layers. So I'll start with the spatial design synthesis layers to get a better idea of what's present in my study area. First, the ecosystem services. We can see there's quite a few present, and the ecosystem services aren't actually displayed in the intro layers, so it's a good idea to look through that. Then I can look at the working lands characteristics. There's a lot of them found in the Willapa Hills area, and a lot throughout this whole watershed. Next, I can click through conservation, and purple is the private lands and green are public lands. And you can see there's a good mix within this area. And simply by clicking different layers on and off, I can start to see where some of these values overlap or are adjacent to each other, and can start to think about what this means for potential planning efforts. So I'm going to turn the working lands layer off, and I'm going to leave conservation priorities on just so I can see how it overlays with some of the other layers as I click through the tool. So turning on the connectivity, I can see it gives a lot more information than the intro display. And again, we can see where certain areas like this lower part overlap with ecosystem services and the working lands that we were just looking at. And also look around my area of interest and see where it falls in the rest of the landscape, where adjacent connectivity areas are. So now looking into the spatial design inputs, I can turn on individual layers that I'm interested in. If I was interested in birds specifically, I could look at bird watching. Maybe that's something that my organization does outreach for, and I want to see what that looks like in the area. It's fairly high, but maybe I'm specifically interested in a specific species. I could look for marbled murrelets and look at their critical habitat. You could do this for any of the specific inputs to see how it overlays with the synthesis data to get a better idea of how the values play out across the landscape. So for this example, the critical habitat, it overlays with some of the conservation priorities on public lands, but some of it also is not overlaid with those conservation priorities. And that doesn't mean that it's not an important area. It just didn't come out as a priority when considering all of the conservation targets together. So this is why looking at specific layers, if your organization has a very particular goal or interest, is a good idea, and you can see how it fits into the larger landscape and other collective values. Looking at individual input layers, you can also see, for example, where certain layers may drive the synthesis information. So in this bottom portion here, you can see that contiguous timberland is one of the characteristics that really impacts that overall working land synthesis data. So continuing to look through our different layer lists, I will go over and look at the threats and resilience data. So turning on the climate resilience data, we can see that the whole area looks fairly resilient, and we can see how this overlays with the conservation inputs and continue to think about what this might mean for potential efforts in the area. Moving from resiliency to threat information, I'm going to go turn on the future development threats. So that's the development and the population growth. And you can see a lot of it falls along the I-5 corridor, which is to be expected. And you can see where it overlays with some of those conservation priorities in the northern part of our area. So since I know that there's a lot of working lands in this study area and other conservation values, I'm going to run the conservation agreement strategy that I discussed earlier, so that I can see how that overlays with my other layers of interest. I might be interested in pursuing some sort of conservation agreement to keep working lands working, or I might be interested in collaborating with a group that does similar work in the area. So I want to know where my priorities may overlap or be adjacent to other potential efforts, so that I have so that I can better communicate and collaborate with others. So when the results load, you can see it will zoom out to the full extent. And again, since it's conservation since it's got connectivity in it and it's only in Washington, it's not going to zoom out to the whole area. Within the results, there are options to change the symbology or look at the attribute table. And if you're interested in seeing exactly what the query looks like behind the scenes, if you click back on strategies, you can see the whole text that's there. So it's connectivity, forest landowners, and some threat of development risk. This is also available within the user guide so that it's a little easier and clearer to read. So since it zoomed me out, I'm going to use my bookmark and zoom back into my area of interest. And then it will turn those intro layers back on. And now I can see how that strategy overlays with, for example, the important connectivity areas, which I know were part of that strategy. And you can see that they overlay also with those private conservation priority areas as well. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to turn off the intro display, and I'll turn that conservation agreement strategy back on. And then I'm going to go use the select by location tool. This is a large data set, and I just want to select the area that I'm interested in. And I already have added the water resource inventory areas, so I will select based on another layer. I'm going to use the intersect tool and the water resource inventory area layer. And I have that selected Upper Chehalis area, so I will use my selected feature. I'm going to rename it so that it doesn't get confusing. The default just says query result, so it's not the most useful. So renaming's important. And then I'm going to run this. So this will select a subset of the data, and it will have all of the attribute information present from all of the data sets within the mapper, as well as additional information that isn't necessarily displayed, such as landscape condition. So once this runs, you'll see the results in the results tab, and you will see the selection in the mapper on the left. And so while this is running, this information, you can export this in a variety of formats, which I will show. The pop-ups show all of that information that's found. You can see the landowner, gap status. You can see the synthesis information, as well as additional information on different resiliency and threat information. And I'll scroll through. There you can see landscape condition. And then you'll also have all of the input information that is found throughout the mapper is present here. And this isn't necessarily the easiest way to go through and intake all of this information. So if you go over and click the ellipses next to the results, you can export this in a variety of formats to a CSV file, to a feature collection. You could save it to your AGOL content and use it in your own maps, change the symbology based on different attributes to get a lot of different information out of it. So now that I've run that select by location tool, the select by location infographics will now be populated. So I can take a look at that and get a graphical display of all of the data that I've been looking at within the mapper. So again, if you hover over the different pie charts, you will see the number of planning units or the percentage of the area that falls into each category. There's working lands characteristics throughout this whole area. And there's also a lot of ecosystem services found within this area, as we can see in the next infographic. And then it also has some conservation priorities that are met by a mix of private and public lands. So not just one or the other. So that's a quick run through of how a user might navigate through the tool by adding in their own study area and clicking through information. If I wanted to share some of the things I discovered in here, I could export a map through that print tool, and it would look something like this, where you've got a legend on the bottom. This is just some of the data that I showed through that demo. So conservation priorities, conservation agreements, and I threw marbled murrelet on there again, just to show that you can include many different things here. And I could send this to others with some discussion topics in order to start collaborating or to start investigating on the ground. So now that I've shown kind of just how a user might navigate the tool if they came across it, I'll show a couple of specific use cases. So this first use case is the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation is highly involved in the connectivity work and interested in seeing where this intersects with highways. So we already have a transportation strategy within the mapper showing where high value connectivity areas intersect with highways. So I can add that to a map with, for instance, the development threats. And so you can see these green hexagons are those that transportation strategy. And this dark red is where there's higher development threats. So I might want to look at these areas that have a higher threat level and prioritize these, or at least prioritize looking into those areas and looking into potential underpasses or improving passage in those areas. If I was another organization that had adjacent land or an adjacent project area, I might want to look at this, and then I could identify areas where those two organizations could potentially collaborate efforts. Here is another use case for fish barriers. There's a lot of work going on in Washington and Oregon looking into fish passage. This is an example from the Northern Oregon coast showing coho critical habitat in green, with the darker green areas being more critical habitat area. And then it's also showing future hydraulic temperature and flow changes in red. So these dark areas are where those are overlapping. And I could also go on ArcGIS Online, or if I had a specific barrier data set myself, and add that and see where those overlap. And that might be areas where I want to further investigate if flow changes will make barriers worse, or areas where riparian restoration might be worth looking into. So that's a couple of specific use cases. There's a lot of information that I just covered and a lot more information within the mapper. And we're really proud of the CCLC and this mapper being an open collaborative where anyone can bring their priorities to the table. The goal of this tool is to be a decision support tool and to guide users in discussions and collaborations and in further on the ground information gathering. So we want this tool to be a tool that will help foster collaboration around collective landscape goals, and believe it helps provide a common starting place for data sharing and for information sharing. So this is the first version of our mapper. We plan to continue to work on developing the tool so that it can be as useful as possible. Through some user testing, there are some slow load times for some of the larger data sets. If you're zoomed into a sub-regional scale, the layer drawing shouldn't have any issues, but as apps continue to develop and we continue to work on this, those issues should decrease. Some of our other next steps include adding in the Washington connectivity data. That work is done, it just needs to be added. We plan to add more strategies to encourage thinking about landscape scale solutions and adding specific use case guides to the website. We also have plans to link up with the incentives discovery tool, which will be released later this fall, and then continue to listen to feedback from all of you on how this mapper can be of the greatest benefit. I will show you again how to access this mapper. So this is the CCLC website. This is the home page. If you go over to tools, there's a link called Conservation Mapper, and it will take you to a place where you can either launch the mapper or access the user guide. And again, the user guide can be accessed from the mapper if you just click right into it and forget to click on the user guide first. So that was an intro to our mapper, and we're available for any questions now.
Great, that's fantastic, Erin. But it's a tremendous amount of work and information you've compiled into this mapper over the many months, and then what you just presented today. So I can imagine there's a lot of thoughts and questions about this tool and how it gets applied to use case scenarios. We received some really good questions, a few of them in the chat box, but mostly in the Q&A box, and we're encouraging people to continue to add questions to that. I'm going to look at those questions and sort of consolidate a few of them into some broader questions and pose them to both you and Tom as a way of kind of interacting and answering some of the questions that our audience have presented. The first one is around the geographic location. The first map that you put up, it showed the kind of the geographic footprint of the Cascades to Coast Collaborative. The question was, why didn't we extend that into Puget Sound or further up the Cascades? Maybe this is for you, Tom, a comment about how the footprint for this mapper and for the partnership was defined initially, and are those boundaries really boundaries?
Yeah, no, those are real boundaries. You know, there was a process. Every boundary has a story, right? And so that's definitely took. There was a story behind getting there, and it's many years old now, and I'm trying to get back to my mind. But you know, I think in Washington we decided to keep things west of the crest of the Cascades, but we didn't want to do that in Oregon because we didn't want to go, because the Willamette Valley is sitting right there, right? And we didn't want to create we didn't want to work in the Willamette Valley because there's all sorts of partnerships in the Willamette Valley. Was the reason that I can remember at the time. Maybe Erin can fill in some holes there. And I saw another one about why didn't we go up to Seattle? I think that we kept things there. A lot of it was driven by the boundary developed by the Washington Habitat Connectivity Working Group as kind of ecological boundary. Another reason is that there is the Cascadia Partner Forum working up in that region. So we didn't want to, we're trying to not duplicate efforts. I mean, eventually, yeah, it would be great to stitch all this together and have a design, but we kind of felt for a design for this broader region, but we had to pick something that was manageable and workable given where we were. So it's a compromise of a whole bunch of different things. what the boundary is. I don't know.
Thanks, Tom. And those boundaries aren't forever boundaries. One of the questions that came up in the box as well was the notion of stitching together geographic and spatial data beyond that footprint, potentially picking up to the Cascadia Partner Forum and moving up into British Columbia and expanding the boundaries of our work to include larger geographies on topics of common interest like connectivity or conservation of working lands. Any thoughts from you, Aaron or Tom, on what it would take or when in our time cycle we would be able to think about expanding the reach of this work that's highly regarded within a smaller geographic area?
I'll let Aaron take that.
I'm not sure. I guess I would have to, I know that there's, we talk to other people who are working in other areas. So there's communication going on. I don't know if there's like, I don't think we have a timeline of that necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I think this is, we're trying to get this right within a more focused area and show its utility, but we should also be having, I think, conversations with other collaboratives and other geographies to see what data sets people would like to see scaled up at larger levels and how we go about that. I think we could do those potentially concurrently. The next question centers around working lands. We use that term a lot. This partnership talks a lot about sustaining working lands into the future, as well as conservation. What's the current definition of working lands? The observation was it seems to focus mostly on working forests, but how about farms, shellfish lands, and others? Are those in the system now? And at what point might we look at enhancing the working lands database? Question
Yeah, that's a great question. We did have a broader look at working lands in the beginning and decided to concentrate on working forests because there is a lot more data and people involved in that. We have talked about broadening that in the future. I did have some data at some point on the shellfish and farms. However, we were going for the most readily available data, and working forests just was working out at the time. So I think that's something we could definitely expand to in the future.
Great. Next one's about climate. We have a data layer on climate resiliency. There was a question in the Q&A box about what's the criteria used for determining climate resiliency. And maybe this question leads into how a person answers questions about any of the data layers, Aaron, on the metadata.
Yeah, so all of the data has metadata. So if you download it, you can look at it, or you can look at it through the show details option for the layers. And that was based off of the Nature Conservancy did some climate resiliency modeling. The only things that we did was synthesize data that already existed, besides the connectivity work, which is a different thing. We weren't creating our own models, so we use data that already existed. So the sources of all the data is in the metadata. Yeah, and that I know the climate one specifically what was based off of data from the Nature Conservancy.
Right. So question here on the pixel size and why we use hexagons and what's the pixel size of a hexagon. And I think the question behind that is if you're doing work at a finer resolution than maybe what we depict in the maps, what might a user think about doing?
Yeah, so we used 500-acre hexagons. That's similar to other landscape scale efforts that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been involved in. And that's part of why we emphasize that this is at the regional scale. This isn't necessarily meant to be looked at for parcel level information, but more how to see how different lands fit into the larger landscape. So if you really wanted more fine scale information, that would be beyond the scope of this tool.
There might be opportunities because we've sourced much of this information to receive finer scale resolution by connecting us with us, and we could connect you to that source. I know some of the oak woodland data, some of the information that we upload on this is a finer resolution, but we scaled it all to the standard pixels. But if there's additional need for that, there's a potential opportunity for us to help you connect with finer scale data. So let's scale out a little bit here and answer another question that came in about how transferable do you think this technology is to other landscape collaborative groups? We'll start with you, Aaron, and then maybe you can weigh in on that as well, Tom, knowing your history with other collaboratives and their technical approaches. But why don't you start, Aaron, with your experience in sort of forcing or cajoling or getting this system to work and produce the results that it is, and then how transferable is it? What technology do you think is the way?
Yeah, I think it is. We looked at other collaboratives who are doing similar things and discussed with them. One specifically, the South Atlantic collaborative has been doing things like this, though they have a coder who like helps make their tool, so it's not necessarily on ArcGIS Online, which is how we did it. I think ArcGIS Online is nice because it does have built-in tools and allows us to just upload our data and use that. So that if an organization has access to it, then that's really useful. I guess you could get into issues where you don't have Esri accounts, and then that could be a problem. But I think it's very transferable to other collaboratives. Others are doing it too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd agree that, I think the tool that Aaron developed this and the data sets, they're all, kind of, they're out there and people can use them and develop them. I think the key approach that you need to think about is the process that you engage people and identify those values that you want to put into the landscape, into the whatever mapping tool. So that's definitely important too.
Good. There's a question on climate resiliency as well, and maybe it points back to the source information. But the question was specifically, does our tool have the capacity to overlay or rate carbon sequestration potential for the landscape? And what were the criteria for determining climate resiliency on the layer that we include?
Yeah, so we had some carbon storage potential data in there. Again, that was from an analysis that we didn't do. We were using readily available other data sets and models that people have done because we were trying not to duplicate effort as much as possible. So I would look into the source in the metadata for that. And then when we split things into like relative values, that's also available within the metadata for how we categorized high versus moderate and low for the resiliency.
This leads to a question too about uploading new information. So this project really made an assessment of the best available information that we think is useful for large-scale conservation planning. But people will have other sets of data they would like to see uploaded, either as a result of their work or some future rendition. What is a process for having those data sets added to the landscape mapper, Aaron?
Yeah, so for right now, we didn't necessarily want the mapper to be to house all of the data sets that everyone's interested in. We did have lots of user testing and groups and talked about data that people were interested in. A lot of the data that people were interested in is also available on ArcGIS Online. So instead of having all those layer lists overwhelmed with a number of data sets, I've looked into creating a group where users could add data they're interested in there, and it would be really quick to add to the mapper. But that's something that we have been discussing on the best ways to include other data sets that people are interested in.
Okay. So in a similar vein, there's a question about maintaining the data set over time. And will the system just maintain current data? Will people be able to access historical data? What's the sense of longevity of the data sets that we have, and how do we update those as data are updated, things like population growth and new information as it becomes available?
Yeah, so for right now, it is a snapshot in time with all of the data that's included. we've talked about doing potential updates in the future or looking into things. I know there's other groups that are using like Google Earth Engine to do more live updates. So that's something that we have been discussing for moving forward.
Good. We have just a minute or two left. I want to squeeze in a few more because this is really a rich discussion. A question about adding species-specific information in Oregon. I think they're referring to the connectivity information, but can you give a kind of a synopsis of the status and the expected time frame for adding the Oregon species data layers?
Yeah, so the Oregon is doing a whole statewide connectivity analysis, and the CCLC is help supporting for those 3 species, which Alan actually might know the time frame of that better than I do, since he's been sitting in on those calls more than I have. But I think we're still a little ways out on that, like at least a few months, I would say.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, like you said, it's a few months out. I think more towards the end of this calendar year, and I think beyond that for the remaining species. But for those first 3, it's looking towards the calendar year for that.
Okay.
Thanks, Alan.
Great. Well, listen, it's just a bit past the top of the hour. We covered a lot of ground in an hour, and I really want to acknowledge everybody's participation and joining this effort, and the CCLC leadership team for helping sponsor this event and providing the directional support, the Fish and Wildlife Services Science Application Program for providing the majority of funding and in-kind to create this system and help us update it over time. But mostly I want to thank Aaron and Tom for their presentations today, and thank you, the audience, for joining. We really hope this project helps spark additional conversations about conservation in the region and beyond, particularly where we can collaborate in new ways and with new partners to not only do the work we're doing within our organization, but also scale it up and to achieve larger conservation values, both for species, for people, for working lands, and for the economy. So I'd like to close by saying thank you all. We invite you to use this tool, join our mailing list, connect with us if you have an interest in applying the tool to your work or becoming more involved in the work of the Cascades to Coast Landscape Collaborative. Thank you all again, and thanks for joining.